I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And Eric Puchner, I've been looking forward to talking to you about dream states since we booked this interview, and it was like weeks and weeks and weeks ago. You have done something with the American West. You have done something with family saga and marriage. You have lots of feelings about marriage, and I'm kind of interested to talk to you about some of them. This book is a wonder and a marvel, and it's sort of built around three characters and a love affair gone awry. I don't think I'm giving away too much there because you sort of spell it out early. Can we talk about how this book started for you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you for the kind words about it. I've been working on this book a long time. I think it took me about 7 years, actually. Yeah, so many drafts, and it was quite a bit long. It's a long book already, and it was quite a bit longer than it is now. So it's so hard to go back and piece together exactly, what the genesis of a book was. But I knew that I wanted to write about Montana. And my wife and I have been going to the same house in Montana for the past 25 years every summer, which is a house that has been in my father-in-law's family. It was his grandfather who actually built it. He came over from Lithuania. He was penniless and one of the few Jewish people in Montana at that time. And he had to live in a packing crate for a little while. And I guess the story is that the trains would go by and toss him free coal, so that he could, not freeze to death in the winter. But he ended up opening a dry goods store and becoming comfortably middle class. And then he built this house on Flathead Lake, which is the house that we visit every summer. And apparently it took several years to build because the guy building it was a drunk. And if you go visit the house, there's not a right angle in the entire house. But it's a wonderful little house on Flathead Lake. Not what people imagine. It's not in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods right on the lake itself. It's a middle class summer home, or what once was, and there are houses on either side very close to it, and you have to cross a major trucking route to get to the lake. But it's so beautiful out there, and it's been a huge part of my life. So I wanted to write about that house. Not the autobiographical elements. Everything in the book is made up, but that place itself has meant so much to me. So I wanted to write about the beauty of that place, but also the way that beauty is increasingly being jeopardized by climate change.
I've never been to Montana, and that is a miss on my part, and I will correct it at some point. But, somehow other places keep popping up. But the sense of place that I get isn't just physically for the house that you're writing about, and isn't just physically for the lake, and it isn't physically just for the community and the climate change, but also this idea of the American dream, right? You're supposed to want these big Western skies. And I know you grew up in Southern California, but there is that mythology, right, of the American West. And Montana certainly represents, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. It all sort of comes together in a way that for a long time was sort of hyper-masculine, right? Like cowboys and war and all of this kind of stuff. And then it was like guys wandering off to, find themselves in the woods, or in some cases, stalk wolverines. But I want to talk about your cast, because you have taken this place and you've sort of given it a slightly different filter than some might expect. And I love these characters. Even when I was mad at a couple of them, and you might know who I'm talking about, but I had a couple of moments with characters where I was like, you can do better. You can totally do better as a human being. But it seems like you start with a friendship. Even though we open with a wedding, it's friendship that's driving this book.
Yeah, I'm really interested in male friendship, and I don't think it's written about enough. We have wonderful books about female friendship. Those Elena Ferrante books are so wonderful, and some of my favorite books on the planet. But I was trying to think about, is there a great American novel about male friendship? There are maybe a couple, but I wanted to tackle that as a theme, and I was pretty sure early on that it was going to be a book that covered a lot of ground time-wise, that I was going to cover about 50 years, and that it was going to be centered around this house and this friendship. I'm kind of madly in love with house novels. I'm not sure why, but a lot of my favorite novels, like To the Lighthouse or Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson, or James Salter's Light Years, they center around a house, and I think it's because you watch everybody get older, and you watch this house also get older and age, and yet the house is supposed to be like the permanent thing that we put on Earth. It has the illusion of permanence, right? Doesn't it? And there's something really poignant about time being kind of an antagonist in a book, and watching this house, these characters get older. The house may be staying the same or maybe becoming increasingly dilapidated in the case of the Lighthouse. But to watch that dream of permanence kind of decay, I think that a lot of us are in denial about our own mortality as well, and the fact that we're going to be old. So there's something just really poignant about home ownership to me, and particularly like a house that's supposed to be like represents summer, and summer is supposed to be the eternal time that doesn't age. And to get old in that house and to have all these things happen, these interpersonal dramas and alienations and all that stuff, it's really compelling to me.
Okay, if you haven't already, you need Northwoods, the Daniel Mason novel. It's 400 years.
We have it on it's sitting on my book, on my bedside table. So
I promise you. I know you have a lot to do with touring for Dream State, but I take it on the road with you. It will do all of the things you want it to do. But it's 400 years in a house.
Yeah,
in Western Mass, great. And it is absolutely, absolutely fantastic. But let's go back to this cast, because it's a pretty tight cast, actually. For 50 years in this sort of world, it's a really tight cast. I'm wondering who got lost when you made all the cuts. I mean, if this book, and I will say it's long, but it doesn't feel long. I mean, it's 400 and a couple pages over. I mean, it's not, but it flies for a novel that covers 5 decades.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. That was one of my biggest concerns about the book, and I'm glad to hear that people are finding it absorbing. Yeah, so I mean, it's about 3 friends really. It's about Garrett and Charlie, who have been friends since college, best friends since college, and they're both dealing with a kind of shared tragedy in their past, the death of a friend. And then it's about Cece, who is, when the book opens, engaged to be married to Charlie, and so flies out a month early to his family's house in Montana by herself, and ends up meeting Garrett, and things get kind of complicated because of that. But it really, I was interested in the opening of the book, heading towards this particular moment, which is kind of like the fulcrum of the book, and talking about sort of like where the book came from. One of the seeds of the book was this wedding in which half the attendees are felled by norovirus, which is making the rounds again. Everybody keeps texting me, "I've got norovirus. What did you do to me?" As if I'm responsible somehow. But anyway, it's a horrible, horrible virus. It's incredibly contagious. It only lasts a couple of days, luckily, but it's,
Yeah, but it's an unforgettable couple of days. It's horrific.
Yeah. I was actually the officiant at a wedding where norovirus ran rampant. It was somebody who was coming over from Australia, and he had gotten it from the ice in the train or something. He had taken a train across the U.S. to Montana. It was in Montana at the house. And I officiated this wedding, and the flower girl, this isn't in the book, but the flower girl threw up on her way down the aisle. The groom was green-faced and had to sit down during the vows. I mean, it was something else. And then, of course, at the end, there was a square dance man, and everyone do-si-doed and made sure to, distribute the viruses as evenly as possible throughout. So I should say, though, that those people are dear friends of mine, and they have 5 kids and are very happily married. That wedding itself, I felt like I wanted to write about it, partly because like the seeds of my short stories and novels often come from comic situations, not because I'm wedded to making the reader laugh out loud, although I'm not opposed to it. It's more just like comic situations have so much potential as fiction, because there's this discrepancy between expectation and actuality, right? And that's what great fiction is made of.
I think that's also partially why the novel works for me as quickly as it does. Garrett's dad, all of it. I was just like, wait a minute, where am I? Who are these people? And I cannot get enough of them. And I think it was because there would be moments where, if you're human, you have laughed at, shall we say, an inopportune moment, or maybe in a moment that's considered inappropriate. That, to me, makes stuff interesting, because what are you laughing at, right? Like, how uncomfortable are you? And sort of watching sort of things unfold early on, I'm like, okay, this is going to be slightly manic. And it is until it isn't. And then The tone is remarkably consistent, though. And that's kind of hard to pull off when you're doing like the epic of X number of decades, right? Like keeping the tone consistent, keeping the characters moving in a way that's believable. For a stranger like me, hi. I mean, you've been living with these people for 7 years. And then someone like me comes bouncing along.
I'm so glad that that's the case. I mean, tonally, I mean, I guess you could say that I write in a kind of semi-comic vein, and I don't mean like knee-slappingly funny or anything like that, but I do like that comic distance because it's a way of sort of avoiding melodrama on the one hand, but also, I mean, this sort of like, I'm not the first person to say this, but tragedy and comedy come from the same thing. I mean, they come from the absurdity of existence and of life, and we laugh and cry because of that absurdity. So they're very close. They're very close in my mind, very closely linked. They're two sides of the same coin. And so I don't really differentiate necessarily between the impulse to laugh and to cry. And as you say, sometimes that sort of like inappropriate laughter comes from a place of shock and possibly even, grief. So I'm interested in exploring that sort of the porousness between those two things.
So when you're working with this cast, and we'll stick to the three majors, right? We'll stick to Garrett, Charlie, and Cece, and there are people who come in and out, and there are people that we meet as time goes on and whatnot. But let's just sort of stick to the trio. Who showed up first? I mean, yeah, you're talking about male friendship, but I mean, Charlie and Garrett have sort of a lovely origin story that I'm going to let readers come to, but it's kind of a sweet moment that is unexpected, especially for college-age men. But yeah, you've got this idea, right? You're sort of laying the runway. I know I want to be in Montana, and I know I want to write about this place and what it means to me, and I want to write about friendship. But then you've got to add the people.
That's not an ingredient that's fully cooked before I put it in. I mean, I don't know who the people are, right? I mean, everything, all my first drafts are exploratory. I'm trying to figure out who the characters are, what they're going to do, and how they're going to surprise me. And now this cat is surprising me. Cece, I wrote the first chapter I wrote, I believe, was the very first chapter of the book. That's not usually what I write. I mean, short stories, I start at the beginning, and then I often write the end, and then try to fill in the middle, which is the hard part. But with a novel, I mean, I had an idea early on, as I said, that I wanted to cover 50 years, and I had the idea of the emotional effect that I wanted in the book, but I had no idea what was going to happen, except for that norovirus wedding, and that was going to sort of be the sort of narrative fuel for that first section of the book, but I really didn't know what was going to happen. And one of the fun parts of the book for me was trying to be a bit inventive in the second half in terms of what to elide, what to leave out, to jump years between chapters in some cases, and leave a lot of that stuff in the white space where maybe it could sit there and resonate a bit without being directly expressed. And so I did this in my first novel too, for some reason. I'm interested in sort of like all the trappings of the old-fashioned novel, believable characters. I mean, to me, imagine, I always, since I teach fiction to grad students and undergraduates, there's a lot of discussion about the imagination and what it even is. And someone will turn in a story and it's got like a tap dancing bear in it or something, and everyone's like, oh, that's so imaginative. And it is, I suppose, but that's also something you could just dream up after like taking a gummy or something, whereas true imagination to me is like capturing like the full complexity of a human being on the page. I mean, that takes real work and real imagination for me. So all that is to say that I'm interested in writing about real people and fleshing them out in the style of an old-fashioned novel, but I also wanted to do something else as well. And in the second half of the book, sort of like push it into sort of a bit of a stranger place, or at least something that's less familiar than you might expect.
I love the idea of imagination being not necessary. Like, okay, world building. I've said this before on the show, but world building is a phrase that's been taken and somehow limited only to science fiction and fantasy and things like that. And I'm like, well, actually, I mean, if you're writing in 2025 about a housewife in Boston in 1950, I mean, yeah, that's world building, right? Like,
absolutely.
We've all picked up a novel, and I'm not even talking about historical fiction, but we've all picked up books where something happens and suddenly you're just ripped out of the story and you're kind of like, oh, am I going back? I mean, that's sort of the joy of reading for me, is moving myself into a different place. It's time travel. Sometimes it's just pure magic, and sometimes it's John Updike, and you're like, oh, right, this guy. I haven't thought about this guy in a really long time. Or like watching how your own relationship to literature evolves and how you respond to readers you loved when you were younger. I mean, I love it when Virginia Woolf comes up. I love it when Marilynne Robinson comes up. James Salter, I'm happy to hear his name, but like, he's not someone that you hear referenced a lot now, right? And I happen to love Light Years. There's some stuff that he's done that I'm just like, oh, I'm in. And even A Sport and a Pastime, when I read that when I was really young, I was like, who is this dude? This is really interesting. Mm-hmm. I may not feel that way about A Sport and a Pastime now, but Light Years holds up.
I can say Light Years holds up. I've read it. I teach a class at Hopkins, which is called The Writer's Bookshelf, Unsung Novels that Writers Love. So I'm often rereading these books or discovering books that are kind of a little bit off the radar, haven't found mass readerships, but are kind of famous among writers. And so a lot of my favorite books, like The End of Vandalism by Tom Drury or Skylark by
that was great.
Yeah,
I remember when that came out.
My students adored it. I just taught it last semester. Yeah. And these books have, for whatever reason, they just sort of like disappear from the public consciousness. And then, but they kind of linger at the margins and they get rediscovered, or they get rediscovered in a big way, like Stoner by John Williams, or else they just kind of like, off in the corner being a wallflower, but enthralling people when they discover them.
Okay, I'm going on record as saying I like Butcher's Crossing better than I like Stoner.
Oh, really? I'm reading that now.
I have some issues with Stoner, and it's partially it's the wife.
Yeah,
it's the wife, and I get what he's doing. I understand exactly the world in which this is being written, but I wish he had taken his foot off the gas just a tiny bit. Like, there is a way to do this that isn't. It veers a little too close to caricature with me for the wife, and
I agree.
I just like. I get what and Stoner is a character. Okay, fine. But, if I'm going to do this, let's just go off into the wilderness and do terrible things. I'm okay. Let's just go out into the woods.
Yeah.
But can we talk about sort of your personal literary influences as well? I mean, I love the fact that you're teaching these books that I always kind of thought should be taught. But I do sort of feel like there's a little bit of sort of, I don't know if it's technically fair to say Cheever or like Carver. Like, there's a certain kind of dude writer, an American dude writer, where they became reference points, right? Like Carver is a reference point for that interior landscape and for the characters and the bad behavior and everything else. And yet there is a love there that I think some people miss, right? Like, your characters genuinely love each other. They are genuinely friends. They may lose touch for a while, but they do love each other.
They do, and that's really important to me to capture. I feel like there's a certain strain in contemporary fiction that is so bleak, and the emotional responses that the characters have are so out of left field that I start reading some of these books, and I the voice is great. They're funny. I'm really enjoying it. I'm really excited about it. And then the character will do something that no human being would ever do in a million years. But I think it's sort of, I'm going to have this character react in this kind of alien way because that's going to make me distinctive and original. I don't know. I don't know what the thought process is. But it does throw me out of the book. And I stop caring as much because it begins to lack emotional truth for me. So that was really important for me, that the characters behave believably human ways. And for me, that is partly bad behavior because we all make mistakes. And we all know that only trouble is interesting, really, when we're talking about novels. At the same time, that I wanted there to be like joy, like real joy and laughter and warmth and affection between these characters, because that's the way that I am with my friends. It's the way life is, full of joy and sadness, both. And the reason I admire all those Russian novelists so much is that they just captured the whole gamut of emotional experience.
Okay, you can do Anna Karenina, and yes, you can do all of the Russians, but I also feel like there's a little touch of Richard Russo to you.
Well, thank you. I've never read him. I'm ashamed to admit, but I've been meaning to for years. So
It's kind of that wink and a nod, and you have that sort of underlying bit of, well, seriousness. I mean, he's not shying away from stuff, but then you get a dog that's behaving badly, and it's just, okay, here we are.
Yeah.
There's also a little bit of Evan S. Connell, I think, the Bridge, Mr. and Mrs. Bridge.
Oh, I mean, those are two of my favorite books.
Okay,
I love Mrs. Bridge.
Yes.
Wow,
okay. That is the better of the two. It is the
They're
better
both, it's hard to even separate them, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but I still think so. I have not reread Mr. Bridge probably in like a good decade. But Mrs. Bridge does come up in conversations. It's like Edward P. Jones, Lost in the City. Like, there are a lot of writers who are like, that book is an absolute touchstone for them.
Oh, I didn't know that. I mean, I adore Edward P. Jones.
No. It comes up a lot. And of the three, it is Lost in the City is reliably the one. Occasionally you'll get someone say, oh yeah, in the known world. All Aunt Hagar's Children doesn't come up quite the way Lost in the City does, but Mrs. Bridge has started to pop a little bit in that way too, and I'm like, oh, I should go back and reread this. It's been a minute.
I mean, I just taught that book recently too. I've read it a number of times and I adore it. I mean, it just has that perfect sort of comic mix. I mean, it's so funny and it's so sad, but she's also like a very deeply flawed and deeply repressed and frankly racist and all sorts of problems. And yet she's also somehow sympathetic underneath it all, because she's so spiritually imprisoned in that life.
She also just reminds me of a lot of women I knew of a certain age growing up, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that is part of the fun. That sounds weird to say it's part of the fun, but one of the reasons I read is so that I can spend time with characters that I may or may not recognize. But when you do, it's always kind of like, oh, right. Oh, yeah. Hi. I read to expand my world, right? And like the characters in Dream State are familiar to me. I have some friends from college that, but it's wild to be in this landscape that is unfamiliar, and yet at the same time, like, I get the emotional landscape kind of immediately.
Oh, good.
That's great. Listen, I would not recognize a Wolverine in a lineup. I'm sorry. I have I see enough cute animal videos on Instagram, so I know what like a wombat looks like, and I know what a possum looks like, but a Wolverine, no idea. No idea.
Yeah, there aren't any cute animal videos of Wolverines in hot tubs, I don't think, yet. Probably the Wolverines are, unlike bears, grizzlies, and unlike wolves, I mean, they're in retreat. They're heading north because of the snowmelt. And I mean, before I started this book, I knew almost nothing about Wolverines either, but there's a wonderful man and writer named Doug Chadwick, who's got a book called The Wolverine Way, which I pored over and then met with in Montana and sort of based. There isn't a ton of Wolverine stuff in the book, but there's a couple chapters devoted to it. And I should just say that Garrett becomes a biologist who's studying wolverines in Glacier National Park, and all of that stuff is based on Doug Chadwick's work with wolverines. So, but yeah, the wolverines are heading north and they're disappearing because the snowmelt is disappearing, and they're completely dependent on the snow pack to survive.
But Garrett's changed. I didn't see Garrett ending up as successful as I was delighted. I was absolutely delighted, but I didn't expect it. And you're playing, Charlie goes to medical school and becomes quite good at what he does. He's an anesthesiologist in Los Angeles. And Cece ends up dropping out of medical school and figuring out her stuff. But this sort of pull me, where does my career go? What do I want? What does ambition look like? But yeah, I really should be married. And the marriage thing, it's kind of, to me, delightfully old-fashioned in a way, especially because they're all kind of coming to it on the younger side of things. And sort of, this is what I want, this is what I want, this is what I want. And I'm always kind of fascinated by that.
Well, I mean, they're, both Garrett and Cece are quite ambivalent about the whole idea of marriage, and Garrett in particular at the beginning. I'm interested in marriage. I mean, I've had a long marriage myself. We never thought we were going to get married. We've been together for 10 years longer than we've been married, which has been a long time. So my wife, Catherine, and I. But I'm interested in marriages, whether it's sort of becoming obsolete. Is it a dying institution? Is it not a dying institution? how do we feel about marriage? How do the different generations feel about marriage? I feel like, on the one hand, there are my grad students and the sort of polyamorous couples I see at the climbing gym when I go climbing or in their early 20s, and have a kind of a very different idea of what a union, might be. And so I'm just interested in that. I was interested in that question, like, what is marriage? Can it survive the younger generations? What does it mean? I mean, so much of the origins of marriage, the word wedlock, I mean, all that stuff is so kind of disturbing. And yet it's something that has survived these many years, and not only survived, sort of transformed to become sort of a romantic union and to mean something that it didn't originally mean. And where is its future? That's partly what the book is about.
I mean, all of the book, though, right, is essentially about the future. I mean, the climate change stuff is, the way it's handled is really, it's so well done. I mean, as we go through, and it's like, oh, wait. You'll drop a line here, you'll drop a line there, and it's always sort of humming in the background. And then when we get to the moment where we know, like, there's a bit towards the end, and the lake has changed and some other things have changed before the filming, the reference I'm talking about. It's so realistic. I mean, it's what we're going through right now, right? Like, we knew it was creeping up, and wow, is it here right now? Like,
I know. I mean, there's a scene in the book, there's a chapter in the book that's set in LA, and the Hollywood sign is burned up and been rebuilt, and the Griffith Observatory looks like I think I say an egg cup holder or something, because half of it's burnt. And that was supposed to be 10 years from now. It's eerie how quickly this stuff is happening, and profoundly upsetting. I mean, one of the reasons that I was so interested in writing about climate change is my personal experience with the West, and going to Montana every summer for 25 years. Some summers we go and we spend a glorious week in glacier hiking. There's no smoke anywhere. We come home, we swim by the lake. It's a seasonable 80 degrees, 85 degrees or whatever, even 90. And then other times we go, it's over 100. The smoke, not necessarily from Montana fires, though sometimes from Montana fires, but from Oregon and Washington, because it all drifts eastward. Is so bad that the air quality index is in the red. You can't go outside. We're stuck inside for days at a time.
Here we have this idea of sort of, the wide open American West and the skies that never end and everything else. And so to hear you say, well, there are days we actually just can't go out because the air quality is so terrible. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. We think of that as like Pittsburgh in the 1920s, before we had, any kind of legislation to make sure that we weren't poisoning ourselves. And to see that we're here again, right, is just, it's shocking.
I don't think, although, there was that year when it came down from Canada and blanketed New York, but I don't think people who don't live in the West, in the Mountain West, or in the coastal West really understand what it can be like. I mean, there was a summer when the AQI was, I think, in the 300s. It was worse than Delhi. And it's all just it's wildfire smoke. And it's horrible for your health. I mean, it's not just that you can't go outside. It's really terrible for your health. And my father-in-law, who grew up, he sent himself through Harvard by fighting fires. And he was a hotshot in the summers fighting fires. His throat is already so damaged that he gets laryngitis every summer and has to wear a mask around. I mean, it's real. It's here already. And part of me wanted not to set the book in the future at all, because it really isn't the future anymore.
Right.
But I did want the characters to age, and I was very interested in writing about old age and a long marriage as well. So I had to make things worse and worse outside.
I mean, watching the evolution of these characters, and I'm getting a glint in my eye as I think about this, because everything to me, it's funny that you say, well, you cut all these pages out and it's much shorter than it was. And I'm like, I didn't feel like anything was missing. I actually liked the time jumps. And I liked the sort of, Cece has a detour into a career choice that I recognized immediately. Cece opens a bookstore. It was a delight to hang out with Cece while she was learning some stuff about bookselling. It's always a delight to hang out with Cece, but I'm laughing just thinking about those pieces. But watching how things unfold for Charlie and Garrett and Cece and the other people in and around their lives, I believed all of it, right? And I don't know if that's because of the time jump. chapters, or if it was because I just gave myself over to them as sort of a tribe of humans, right? Like, and yes, I'm talking about fictional characters, like they're real people. That's kind of the point of the novel, right? Like we can spend all this time with this interiority and time becomes very stretchy and elastic, and it's kind of fun. Even if you are covering some serious, I mean, there's addiction, there's some other stuff in the book, but to be able to really sit with these characters. Did you surprise yourself, though, while you were writing this, or did you sort of have an idea where things were going before they got there?
No, I definitely surprised myself again and again. I mean, that's what makes it fun for me. There's always this sort of moment that happens if a book is working or going to work, or if a story is going to work. There's plenty of stories I write that don't work and never have this moment, but I've been very lucky. The 2 novels I've written, it has happened, where the book becomes smarter than you are, you know?
Okay.
And suddenly, like, something that was sort of buried in the first part of the book reappears in this way that just feels perfect. It resonates. The themes start to come together. I mean, one of those, just to give you an example in this book, it just had to do with the sort of personal drama. There's a major betrayal in the book, and these characters having to cope with the mistakes they've made in the past. That intersects in the book in the second half with sort of the public drama of the mistakes that our generation, Generation X, has made by not taking care of global warming when we could, and how that sort of reverberates and causes consequences that are passed on to the next generations. Those 2 threads sort of meet in a thematic way that was kind of a surprise for me. But that's also what writing is about, right? I mean, you put these things in motion, you don't know where they're going, and then in the second draft, third draft, you start to find out where the hot spots are. Like, oh, these things are, oh, right, yes. You have other readers read it, and you say, oh, yeah, these things are connected, aren't they? And then you develop that in subsequent drafts.
Do you miss these characters?
Well, right now, I mean, I've been publicizing the book and talking about it so much that I certainly don't miss myself.
It's still different.
I'm feeling a little mortified by hearing myself talk so much, but yeah, I do. I mean, there's nothing like writing a novel. It's when you're in the middle of it and the characters are in your head and you go for a run and it's like teleportation because you immediately reappear back at your door and you don't remember a single step of your run because you've been thinking about that next chapter. It's such a great feeling to be just overtaken by a book. There's this great quote by Turgenev, I think, and I think he was talking about fathers and sons or something, and I don't remember who the character is, but somebody asked, like, so how did writing go today? And he said something like, well, you wouldn't believe what Sasha did today. I'm saying Sasha because there's so many Russian characters named Sasha. I don't remember fathers and sons very well. But yeah, so like this idea that the characters start behaving in ways that you don't expect, that surprise you when you sit down to write. It's such a great feeling. It must be a little bit the way that, a parent feels, giving birth to something that surprises you.
I would say that, yeah, all of the parents in Dream State are a little surprised. Yes. I think they are all constantly surprised by their tiny people who become not tiny people.
Yeah.
Which is actually kind of delightful as a reader. And I'm definitely staying away from the offspring because I do feel like that's getting dangerously close to spoiler territory. But, there's this idea that novelists work sort of in your own vacuum, right? Like you read a lot, you write a lot, you read a lot, but you teach, your wife is a novelist, your editor is one of the sharpest eyed dudes out there. What is sort of the collaborative process look like to you? I mean, yeah, you just talked about going for a run and being like, I'm so lost in this novel, but part of it is sort of chewing through the excess, right? Like you started the show by saying, I whacked a lot of pages from this book and now we have the thing that we have.
Well, I mean, I'm so lucky to live with a wonderful writer, Catherine Noel. She's a brilliant novelist and she's a brilliant editor. So, I mean, she sees everything first. And she saw the first draft of this, second draft. I don't know how many times she's read this book and just helped me immeasurably. So, I mean, we do that for each other. And I mean, people sometimes ask me, how can you possibly be married to another writer? And my response always is, how could I not be? I mean, if I was married to a lawyer and woke them up in the middle of the night because I was fretting about the placement of a semicolon, they would have divorced me long ago, right? So we understand each other. Not that I don't drive her crazy sometimes, but we understand each other on that level. So it's, we're always each other's first readers. And then Thomas, my wonderful editor, I'm so lucky to have ended up with him, Thomas Gebremedin, at Doubleday. He saw something, he read the book, he saw something in it, loved it, but also had a vision for the next draft, which wasn't drastically different, but greatly improved the structure of the book in some ways. And he's just a wonderful editor. So, we sort of have this idea that books, I don't know, at least I did when I was a young reader, they just kind of fall out of the sky. And there are those myths about, Jack Kerouac writing on the road in 6 weeks or whatever on a piece of ticker tape, or 2 weeks. Maybe it's Faulkner in 6 weeks with As I Lay Dying. But But what you don't hear is that actually Kerouac had been working on that book for 10 years. It was just the latest draft, he had a breakthrough. But yeah, it's a long project. It always takes longer than you think it's going to take. And yes, and I'm chair of the department at Johns Hopkins right now. I teach. I have 2 kids, and it's a lot. But I find if I'm not writing every day, or at least trying to write when I have free time, I get horribly depressed. It's not even a matter of feeling like I should be writing. It's more like a matter of why didn't I write? Because I feel really bad today.
You've been teaching, though, for a while. You taught out west at, Claremont McKenna, too?
I taught Claremont McKenna for a few years. Right. Yeah, before that, I was up in Northern California teaching.
Right. You were a Stegner Fellow, too, and isn't teaching part of the Stegner?
It isn't actually.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
It's not. But once you leave, there are some. I think now they give them to everybody, but there was it was more competitive. Okay. So I did. I what's called a Jones lecture. I was there, and so was Catherine. She was also a Stegner Fellow.
So, out of curiosity, though, you've been teaching for more than a decade. Let's put it that way, right? You've been teaching for a while. What have you learned from your students?
That's a good question. I learn a lot from my students. The grad students in particular are so brilliant. And they're constantly giving me stuff to read, which is sort of a wonderful thing because they're just in touch with young contemporary writers in a way that I'm not. And so they're constantly sort of blowing my mind with talented young writers that they're foisting on me. I think also it's been really interesting back when I was in college, writing workshops were just, they deserve the sort of bad reputation they had, I think. People were like throwing punches at each other. There was no structure whatsoever. It was that you either had a professor who was leading the writing workshop who was like a self-assigned guru who spoke just pontificated the entire time, or else you had somebody who was completely hands-off and didn't really involve themselves. And so to watch the workshop evolve has been really interesting to me, and to watch it get better and better and better, and the students have everything to do with that. So that's been really interesting to me as well.
I kind of like the idea that they're pushing the art forward by not, because I've heard some of the stories, Iowa back in the day, you can't be a bookseller and not have heard the stories, right?
Right. Or Barry Hannah pulling a gun out and
that actually that I worked on one of Barry's books a long time ago.
Oh, you did? Did he pull a gun out? I hope not.
No. It was A Million Years at Grove, and he was, in his very polite dotage at that point. So I didn't get the Barry Hannah that we had read about and heard about and some had experienced. I got, Grandpa.
Yeah, okay.
Barry is one of those people who are like, oh, I heard those stories. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that used to just be something you expected, and you also unfortunately expected, sort of some lecherous professors and other things that the creative writing community is very unproud of. To see the sort of, partly what's happened is that there's just been sort of like a power shift where the students are interested and the good professors that I know are interested in sort of relinquishing
right.
some of that power and giving it to the students. And so I do workshops very differently than I used to, and they're much more effective, I have to say, than they ever. And the students are so constructive with each other. mean, even the grad students, it doesn't devolve into a group hug or anything, but they're just so supportive. They're so, at least on the surface, non-competitive. It's remarkable to watch, and also makes me a little sad that my experience in workshop as a young person was so different.
It's exciting to see where writing is going. It's exciting to see where people are pulling from different moments. You know, Jessica Anthony had this novel called The Most that's like kind of a perfect mid-century modern novel, but it's 172 pages. It is this tiny novella, and it takes place over sort of the course of a day, and it's wild how much ground she covers in this book.
I love those books.
It's Dream State sort of makes me think of that in a way where it's this kind of delightful throwback to being told a story, right? Like, I want to know who these people are. There's enough that I recognize that keeps me there, but I don't need everything to be familiar so that I can connect with what's happening on the page.
Yeah, I mean, partly honestly, it's a reaction to autofiction, some of which I love. But I mean, we as human beings, we've always craved story. It's not going anywhere. The death of the novel has been, opined about for how 100 years? Yeah. I don't know, a long time, right? Yeah. The story, people crave stories. There's a part of our brain, some deep-seated reptilian part of the brain that just wants story, and that's not going to go away. And I mean, to me, some autofiction reads a little bit like cowardice to me, as if I'm afraid to write about people who aren't me, because I don't have the authority, and also I might get in trouble. And that's just that really is going to be the death of the novel, if we can only write about our own lives and aren't free to imagine anybody else's lives. That does seem like a death knell to me.
I don't think that's going to happen, though. I really don't. I think at least what I'm seeing with younger talents coming up is that people are asking themselves why they want to do something. And I think that curiosity, right? Like, isn't that what we're supposed to bring to it? But like, okay, so you can look at a book as a thing that you experience, right? Or you can think about it as an experience that's going to be different for every single reader because of what you bring with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are times where I read a lot of Updike and a lot of Cheever growing up for multiple, I read a lot of John Updike when I was young. I don't need to read Updike the way I used to, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there was a familiarity to it, and it was kind of like, oh, well, this kind of makes sense. And then it's like, the adults did what? Like, it's just like, who are these people? What is going on? But I like the idea that I can evolve my reading can evolve with me, and I can evolve with my reading. And that is exciting because, when I was younger, I grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, right? And luckily I had, folks around me who were like, here are all of the books. But it was kind of nice to be able to go from, Baldwin to Morrison. And yes, did I read V.C. Andrews? Yeah, of course I read V.C. Andrews. I was a 12-year-old in the 70s. But to have that sort of range to me is, just read all of the things. Just read all of the things. Read all of the things, and then you're going to find the thing that makes your heart go pitter patter. And that we get to do cool stuff. You get to write it. I get to read it. Like, I mean, it's. What do you miss most about Dream State now that it's done? Because there has to be a little bit of. I know you're promoting the book. I know you're going to be talking about it for weeks and months and years and all this kind of stuff. But the experience of writing it is done. Now you have to kind of hand it over to me and the other strangers who are like, hi, we have feelings about your work.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I miss, the experience of writing it. I'm kind of in mourning that I'm not doing it anymore. And I always feel this way between books. I mean, I've started a new project, but it's very inchoate, and I haven't really had time to dive into it, to reach that moment where you're fully immersed and that's all you're thinking about. I'm not even close to that yet. So, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, being a writer is so solitary when you're actually doing the writing. Right. I was thinking I wrote an essay about the phenomenon of literary astonishment, like how you astonish somebody in a book or a story. And in that essay, I imagined that there was like something that was the equivalent of Snapchat for writers, where you write like Lit Chat or something. You write a sentence and it vanishes forever. Mm-hmm. Like, would you still write your book if after you wrote each sentence it vanished and no one would read it except you? And my answer is yes, I would. I just love writing sentences so much. Like, it's so great that that this book will I hopefully find a bigger readership than my other books have found. I'm excited about that. I'm thrilled. And obviously I want people to read the book. But it's really the writing of it that interests me the most. I love writing sentences.
Yeah, I genuinely think most of the writers I've met over the years, because I've been a bookseller for a really long time, but I genuinely believe that most of the writers I've met would feel the same. Like, who cares? Who cares if it disappears? I've got 1,000 scraps and ideas on cocktail napkins and all sorts of stuff. And it's like, I'm just going to do the work anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do occasionally meet students who want to have written. They're not that interested in the actual, I mean, that mostly they are, but occasionally it's the idea of being a writer that's more attractive than the actual work that's required to be a writer.
All right. Well, I'm leaving that to you because you're in the classroom with them.
Okay.
I get them when they're coming up as baby booksellers and writing their stuff on the side. And then, because there have been booksellers who've gone on. Jonathan Lethem, sort of famously.
Oh, sure.
Was a bookseller. Yeah, it is just exciting to see when sort of the next crop show up, however they show up. Some come through MFA programs, some come through undergrad, some come from coffee shops and bookstores and who knows where. But it's always kind of exciting to see people engage with sentences and books and ideas and characters in a way that might be unexpected to them, too. It's really cool.
Yeah.
This was so great. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. It's really been fun to talk to you. So.
All right, let's do it again sometime. So when the next book comes out, we'll do it again. Eric Puchner, thank you so much for writing Dream State. I have to go back and pick up Model Home in the story collection, so I'm sorry. I'm a little behind. But man, Dream State is going to stick with me for a very long time, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Miwa.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.